conversation with authors Grace Talusan, Rishi Reddi, and Weina Dai Randel to talk about their work. Author Anjali Mitter Duva will moderate this event. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. And before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. Lex Media is also here, and they are recording the event, and it will be posted to the library's YouTube channel as well as Lex Media's website. Jillian and Lauren are here from Bookends in Worcester in the back there. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the author's books, they will also be happy to sign a copy for you at the end of the program. We have a limited amount of snacks from Royal India and the Beijing restaurant for you to enjoy at home. We will pass those out at the end of the program. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Anjali Mitter Duva is an Indian-American writer, editor, and project manager based in France. She is the author of the best-selling historical novel, Faint Promise of Rain, which was shortlisted for a William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. She is an instructor at Grub Street Writers and fiction co-editor at Solstice, a magazine of diverse voices. She was a finalist for a Massachusetts Cultural Council Artist Fellowship. Anjali co-founded and runs the Arlington Author Salon, a quarterly literary series with a twist, runs a book club for teens, and was a co-founder for Chhandika, a nonprofit organization that teaches and presents India's classical storytelling kathak dance. Anjali is a frequent speaker at conferences, festivals, libraries, schools, and other cultural institutions. Educated at Brown University and MIT, she lives in the Boston area where she strives to be a good literary citizen. I'm going to pass the mic to Anjali so she can moderate the event today.
Thank you very much. Is this working well? Can everybody hear me? Great. So we have here three fabulous authors who have very different books, different stories, but equal levels of fabulousness. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each one by one. I'll start with you, Weina, since you're here. I was going to introduce their books, but I think it would be better for you to hear directly from them. So after I introduce you, could you give a little description of your book or books? Just real quick, and to give people a sense of what they are about. And then we're going to hear a very short reading, like 2 or 3 minutes, kind of, so you can get a taste for the books, and then we'll go into our conversation. Good? Yeah? Okay, so Weina Dai Randel is the award-winning author of 4 novels, Night Angels, The Last Rose of Shanghai, The Moon in the Palace, and The Empress of Bright Moon. She's the winner of the RWA, that's the Romance Writers of America, yeah. RWA Rita Award, a National Jewish Book Awards finalist, and a 2-time Goodreads Choice Awards Best Historical Fiction nominee. Her novels have been translated into 13 foreign languages. Weina is also the recipient of a Mass Cultural Council's art grant in 2023. Congrats. Is that super recent? Yes. Yeah, excellent. And she lives right here in Lexington with her family. So you tell us a little bit about your books, and I'm going to hand you this mic. Or you can take that one. Okay.
So thank you.
We're sharing.
Very sweet of you. Thank you so much. So my name is Weina Dai Randel. I've published 4 novels, but I've written more than that. So this is the 3rd novel called The Last Rose of Shanghai. It's a love story between a Chinese woman and a Jewish refugee who fled to Shanghai during World War II. And this book, Night Angels, it's based on a true story of a Chinese diplomat who issued thousands of visas to Jews so they could escape to Shanghai. So that's it. Very simple.
You're supposed to read, though.
Oh, that's right. About that. So I'm going to read from The Last Rose of Shanghai. I have to be honest, I usually, when I go to conferences, I usually don't read. So for you, Helen, thank you so much. Okay, here. 2 days later, I married Chan. Life was strange. Since childhood, I was told I would marry Chen. We had fought, played with crickets in the courtyard, and taken English lessons from our tutor while our parents chatted and drank jasmine tea in the family room. We were the Qingmei Zhuma, Blue Plum and Bamboo Horse, loving friends from childhood and a destined couple to be. Mother had told me repeatedly of my wedding day since I was little. It would be beautiful and beautifully fitting for a woman of my birth, a jade leaf growing on a gold branch. I would put on white powder and bright red lipstick to accentuate my beauty. I would step out my room, my hair elaborately adorned by 1,000 jewels, my neck decorated with at least 3 thick gold necklaces. A traditional red silk veil would drape over my head, and my fingers, glowing with 12 gold rings, would lift the hem of a long dress for an easier walk. With each step, the bells, beads, and tassels on the veil would clink and peal, a melody of happiness and fortune. Someone, likely my maid, would give me a hand to guide me down the pebbled path to the central room, the courtyard, and then the fountain near the gate where a red palanquin would await with 4 lifters whom Mother had hired. As I came close, the musicians would play the lute, cymbals, drums, and a French horn, and the fireworks would crack loudly. The throngs of family and relatives, all clad in festive red, would clap their hands, and the gate of my home would swing open, the red lanterns bouncing, and a Chen would take my hand. But in reality, I was too poor to wear jewelry. I was not beautiful either. My face was swollen, my lips pale, and my waist was soft like a fish belly. None of the dresses fitted me, so in an old gray tunic, I made my way out of the house without furniture to the empty courtyard without servants. I looked like a woman on the way to buy fish at the market. Holding a red silk veil, I started to cross the courtyard. It was quiet there. The ground still wet from yesterday's rain. No sight of musicians, or fireworks, or palanquin, or Sinmei, or relatives. Pei and her children were still sleeping. Near the fountain was Chen's Buick. I stumbled, short of breath, nervous. But I shouldn't be. Chen would be a good husband. We would have as many children as his mother wanted. And we would live in his vast mansion with horses, birds, and gardens. I could play mahjong, rise up late in the afternoon, and scold the servants whenever I was bored. I put the red veil over my head. The world changed. The air wavered like a red screen, and the puddle near my feet roiled like Sassoon's cocktail. Yet my breath caught in my throat, and my heart thudded. Beyond the fringe of the redness, beyond the fountain, beyond the stone lions, stood Ernest, dressed in a traditional red Chinese wedding tunic, a large red bow across his chest. His curly hair was shaped like a precious crown, his smile glistening like sweet honey, his eyes shining like a promise. No more. I took Chan's hand.
Thank you. That was very transportive. All right, next we have Rishi Reddi, and she is the author of the novel Passage West, Los Angeles Times Best California Book of 2020. And it was not easy launching a book in 2020, I'm sure. And Karma and Other Stories, which is a book of short stories, which received the 2008 L.L. Winship PEN New England Award for Fiction. Her short stories have appeared in many places, including the Best American Short Stories. They've been broadcast on NPR, and they've earned honorable mention in the Pushcart Prize. Her reviews, essays, and translations have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Kirkus Reviews, Lit Hub, Partisan Review, and many others. Rishi has received fellowships and grants from the National Book Critics Circle, MacDowell Colony, Breadloaf, and a common theme among this group, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, to which we are all grateful, and the U.S. Department of State. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I will add, which isn't written here, but she also has a whole career as an attorney. Will you tell us about your books?
Is this, so I only have 2 books. And I guess I take 13 years to write each book, so you can calculate out how old I am.
26.
Yeah. That's perfect, thanks, Anjali. I knew I liked you. This is the second one. There was the first one that was a book of short stories, and that took me, 13 years to write too. But what's notable about that is that it contains my very first published story, and that story is called Lakshmi and the Librarian, and it takes place right here in the Cary Memorial Library. And I did come here to do research to see what it looked like, which is a little different than it looks like right now. Anyway. So I will read from this book, which I researched for, 13 years out in far Southern California, about the first group of South Asian immigrants to the United States who came out in the 1910s, a little known population. And I had a hard time choosing what I would read from to find 2 minutes worth. I failed at that. I was still looking as of this morning, and I've just given up and thought I would just read from the first page and a half, because that'll be 2 pages worth. And I spent some time on the first page and a half trying to lure people, and maybe it'll work again. So that's where I get from this. There's a murder in this book, and a love triangle, and a pair of frenemies. There's theft of land and crops. There's interracial marriage between South Asians and Mexicans, and strong friendships between the Japanese and others, and how all of these folks interacted with a white community that was there, that were sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, and very complicated. So I find it hard to characterize what this book is about in these ways. And it's essentially, in the end, a complicated relationship between 2 men who sometimes hated each other and sometimes loved each other. So that's kind of, it follows their story. And this is, I'm going to read from the first chapter, which is actually the end of their story together. So, April 1974. Yesterday in the hospital, when he was still alive, Karak Singh Gill had sat up in bed and, with trembling fingers, placed the key to his apartment in Ram Singh's hand. Ram protested. He did not want it. Karak thrust it toward him. "Keep the box," he insisted, "of things only you and I know about." There was the occasional beep of the heart monitor, the bounce of light on the telemetry screen, the tang of urine and Dettol together. It could have been a hospital in Jalandhar, but it was the Los Angeles glare that came in through the window. Occasionally, a loudspeaker in the hall was heard calling for a doctor. But mostly in Karak's small room, it was the chants of the sacred path that were heard, Ram rising to flip the cassette tape every 45 minutes. And when the evening nurse entered, a tear glistened in her eye. She was very young. As she took Karak's temperature, she was too cheerful, speaking loudly, smiling too broadly, and that was how Ram knew that Karak had only a few hours left. Ram asked if the sound of the prayers were too great, and Karak shook his head. They both knew, how could it be otherwise, that Ram had won Caric had faded first. They both knew this too was inevitable, that Ram found some satisfaction in this. But it did not matter. Women had loved Caric. He had always been dashing. Now that his fine eyes had melted into the hollows of his skull, Ram knew that he, Ram, had had the better life. He felt a twinge of regret. His fingers closed around the key and he slipped it into his pocket. It was not easy to forget. It would never be forgotten what had happened only 50 years ago. The mind does not know time. What had happened was ever present between them, made itself known in every meeting, every conversation, every occurrence, as when Caric allowed a breath to escape him, neglected to draw another, and Ram stood, solemn and empty, in acceptance of this fact. And on that happy
Thank you.
note, I will hand-
Thank you so much. Our third author for the evening is Grace Talusan, and she has a memoir, so we're going from fiction to nonfiction, from two historical fiction books to personal history. And Grace is the author, so her book is called The Body Papers. It won the Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing and the Massachusetts Book Award in Nonfiction. Her fiction's been supported by the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Fulbright, U.S. Artists, and the Brother Thomas Fund, as well as, anybody guess? The Massachusetts Cultural Council. She has published in creative nonfiction in the New York Times, Boston Magazine, and the Boston Globe, and other outlets and anthologies, including one called Somewhere We Are Human. She teaches in the nonfiction writing program at Brown University. Born in the Philippines and raised in New England, Grace currently lives outside of Boston. So tell us about your book and give us a little sampler.
Thank you. So it's a memoir, and it might be different than other memoirs you've read because I wrote this over a long period of time and didn't necessarily think I was writing a memoir. I was writing different stories of my life and then put them together into this book. So I'll read to you from a little bit about my immigrant experiences in particular. My father came to the US first as a student, 2 years after President Marcos declared martial law. His plan was to study with some of the finest doctors and return to the Philippines as an American-trained eye surgeon. He was accepted to a US medical residency program and anxiously awaited the paperwork from immigration. His start date at the American hospital came and went, and still no visa, so he telegrammed the place, begging them to hold his spot. The hospital was well within its rights to give the residency to someone else, but they agreed to give him a few more days. If they hadn't allowed him that one grace, who knows what would have happened? My father is an optimist. With the deadline approaching, he proceeded as if the visa were a certainty and prepared for the move. He visited his dentist, who advised him to extract all of his natural teeth except the 2 healthiest ones. My father didn't grow up with regular dental care or fluoride in his water. It's better to lose your teeth in the Philippines, his dentist told him, than all of your money in America. My father feared the pain of extraction, but he dreaded the unknown expense in the States even more. He opened his mouth to the dentist's pliers. At the Chicago airport, a porter loaded his suitcase into the taxi. It was the first time my father had ever spoken to a black man. He tipped him a coin, and the man stared at the silver in his palm before returning it to my father. "Sir, I think you need this dime more than me," he said. A few weeks into his residency, my father sent for my mother, my older sister, and me. He started moonlighting as a general physician at a prison on nights and weekends. We were supposed to stay for 1 year only, no big deal. But this is the danger of change. You never know what else will shift. We planned to return home to Manila with the pasalubongs that my mother had been collecting for her family. plush towels and high thread count sheets from the clearance rack at Filene's basement at Jordan Marsh in downtown Boston. My father never thought he could make a life in the US, but he began to dream. Who would we become if we stayed? Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just add on to that Grace has did a storytelling with a program called Suitcase Stories. And if you Google her name and Suitcase Stories, you can watch her tell this wonderful story. Well, she tells it wonderfully, and it is a wonderful story of her family's arrival in the US and what ensued. Okay, so now you have a little taste of the books, and we're going to launch into a conversation here, and we will keep some time at the end for questions. And so this is going to be a little free form, but one of the things, the first question that I want to throw out to all of you is, you know, this is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, AAPI, and I think for everybody up here, myself included, we have different reactions to the word Asian American, and they mean different things to us. And so just to start out broadly like that, who would like to be the first to kind of jump in and tell us how you feel about that term and whether it applies to you in any way or not? We're all looking at
well,
this.
I grew up in this country since I was 2 years old. I grew up in a small homogeneous town in New England, close by here, and we were one of the only Asian, at the time, Oriental families in town. And so when I discovered that there was an identity called Asian American when I went to college, I was really happy about that because that could expand my group of friends and people who also identified as Asian American, and I loved it. I love having this identity that wasn't Oriental and that didn't feel so isolating and uncomfortable to always be singled out that way. So I found it very empowering to be identified as Asian American.
And do you feel like that's changed over time, or that still feels, yeah?
Still like it.
Still like it, great. Rishi, looks like you were about to say something.
No, I kind of have the opposite, Grace, and you know, we talked about that when we were prepping for this. Is, you know, the simplest aspect of that definition, I think, is, you know, one way to look at it is that you're simply bicultural, and there's a niceness to that. But I also have often felt that it's too encompassing of you know, the continent is vast, and to be identified as Asian American is so big that it almost doesn't mean anything. I mean, there's so many interrelationships between the largest continent on the planet and the people who live there. So I had to express that before. It also means, I think, over time, in terms of the American part of Asian American, I mean, there's an aspect to it of Asians have not been part of the narrative of the United States in the way that other racial demographic groups have been, and you know, it almost is. We are to me, I have always felt like the perpetual foreigner. Like there's not this long-lasting relationship that there has been between the white population and the black population. Latin Americans that are on a contiguous landmass, isn't that the word, contiguous? And so it's complicated, and I felt that it both simplifies and it pushes out the person who doesn't belong. I mean, the Chinese population has been in the United States since the 1830s. It predated so many Eastern Europeans who came here, and yet we still think of the Chinese as recent immigrants. And the same goes for the Japanese. And there's an aspect to that about being Asian that's not true of any other group.
That's an interesting perspective. And also just to add on to that, because we share the South Asian, Indian aspect, is that I've always felt like it's changing a bit now, but certainly when I was growing up, that when people heard the word Asian, they were usually thinking of East Asia. And even then, not all Asian countries, not all East Asian countries, but I always felt like India was not necessarily considered part of that. Yeah. And even now when people say South Asia, So people think of India, but then I think there's a lot of countries that aren't necessarily thought of, even like Bangladesh or, anyway, so. Weina, what are your thoughts on this? I'm sure you have a
Thank you, Rishi.
different perspective.
Appreciate this one, right? Okay, so I came to this country when I was 24. So I was educated in China and I moved to this country. And when I immigrated to this country, I moved to Texas, Dallas, Texas. And in that town, I was the only Chinese face in the entire town that had 65,000 people. So it was very common for me to walk in the grocery stores and to see how people look at me. And of course, I did not give it that much thought because I was from China and I did not see myself as anything different from anyone. But this is how they saw me. I was Chinese. And then after I started writing, and I really liked American culture. And I love the thought of freedom and individuality and all this education I've learned in graduate school. So the funny thing is, when I talked to my parents, to my family in China, they said I'm an American. They said I'm not a Chinese. My father called me the American daughter-in-law. I was like, what? But so that was a way of them telling me that I have drifted from the traditional Chinese culture. So I struggled a little bit with this concept of Chinese or American because at first I considered myself as Chinese and then I became American. And then as I published, I went to conferences and again, I was the only Asian face in the conference. And people call me the Chinese American. I was fine with it. And because I embrace the essence of the Chinese culture, and I also adore the essence of American culture. And now for me, when I look at AAPI month, it's exciting. I write those listicles for one publication for about 6 months and recommending all those novels written by Asian Americans. And it's exciting because it's this month I would be able to see my book front-facing in the bookstore, luckily with Ayn Rand. That's a very exciting thing for me. And now...
Who's also Asian American.
Seriously? Okay, you fooled me. I was like, okay, Ayn Rand is Asian, right? I still can't forgive her for the fountainhead, by the way, because my husband loves Ayn Rand more than me. So now as a reader, I'm excited to see all the novels published by Asian Americans and Chinese Americans and Indian Americans. For me, it's the time to delve into the history that I'm familiar with and write about the stories of historical figures that I admire. And I also think this is a perfect time with AAPI and with attention on Asia. I can write a novel set in the setting that I'm familiar with, like Shanghai, like other cities in China. And this is my way of telling you Shanghai or other cities in China is not an exotic place, or Asian culture is not exotic. Those settings are a commonplace for me, and those settings are the place with love and the pain, with all the successes and the failures, just like anywhere else. All right, now I'm saying too much.
No, not at all. Actually, this is a perfect segue to the next question because I'm going to put quotes around it. As Asian writers, we are often asked and I have to say I have even a fourth perspective on this because I am Asian American, but I'm like half Asian and half American. So I have one Asian parent and one American Caucasian Jewish parent. So that's like a whole other version of Asian American. And I grew up in France, so that adds another dynamic. But as Asian writers, we're often asked about how much our traditions and our sort of traditions and cultural values imbue our writing. And sometimes that can be a difficult question, and honestly, sometimes it's not entirely welcome. So what are your feelings about if you're asked, you know, how much of your culture are you putting into your books, kind of that kind of thing. But what's your visceral reaction to that, and then your kind of intellectual one? Let's start with Rishi, because she's staring at me.
Yeah, well, only because...
I think it's on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, only because you know I hate that question.
I know, that's why I'm asking it, because we can discuss why some of us don't like it.
I hate it because I don't think an author can write outside of their worldview. Like, it permeates every bit of your writing, and from one sentence to the entire, you know, long 400-page work. And it just, there's so many assumptions in that question that one could actually, that there's a neutral culture, that there's a, you know, that there's a place that you could go to that's neutral, and then another place that you go to that's imbued with this. I mean, it's just not the case. And I also, you know, it not only does that happen inside individual authors' minds, but we see that type of, you know, perspective out in the marketing world, where we classify some books as immigrant books and then other books as, you know, I don't know, give me something, because I can't think of, what is a non-immigrant book?
Women's fiction?
Women's fiction. Yeah, I mean, we all know that there's only 3 or 4 stories that we ever tell anyway. There's, you know, and we've all heard them all before. We just take the little pieces and plug them into different settings, and then if you write a story about, you know, 2 men's friendships and they happen to be from a different country and they settle in California, that becomes immigrant fiction. Really, it's about a friendship between men, which how many of those have we read? So, I don't know, this is like a
Not that many, actually. I think there should be more.
Well, in our era, they're more about women, but I'm going to end up being the sourpuss on this panel.
Every panel
I'm
needs
going
a
to put that out,
sourpuss.
like, right out there. These guys are going to like everything, and I'm going to hate everything, and carry on.
I mean, I can sourpuss a little bit with you in that, you know, there are assumptions made. I mean, it goes back to the whole question of, do you feel like you need to be sort of a cultural ambassador? Can you write something? I know your answer. But these are, you know, these are questions that are asked of us, and I think sometimes it's hard to give that sort of perhaps unpopular answer. So I respect you for doing that, and I think it's important for everybody to hear that, you know, sometimes being as happy as we may be about a month dedicated to our books in particular, we may also sort of bristle at being pegged in a certain place, and especially also when it comes to marketing. Grace.
Well, I mean, I spoke, some college students were asking me some questions about how I was writing and whether I wanted to write against stereotype and all this stuff. And I was like, you need to get everybody out of your head and get like as much privacy as possible. Like, don't even think about any of that stuff if possible, and just try to think about your story and something coming to life, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I think like there's so much that can distract us. They were worried about how people, the impact of their work on people of color, for example. And it's like, let's start like way, way back, which is like, let's finish a short story, let's finish a piece, and start there. Like, have it be what you want to say and be truthful, and don't worry so much about all of that stuff. But for me, like, because I did not have, I mean, I was in libraries every single week, but because I was not exposed to, you know, quote unquote Asian American literature, I didn't know that I could write about Asian people. Like, I didn't write characters that had Asian people in them until I was almost out of college and I'd read Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior. I just didn't think it was allowed. So that was my problem, was not seeing it.
Thanks. Yeah, that's. That's a lot. Weina, what do you?
Okay, so
You started to talk about that when you were answering the other question.
So yeah, okay, so I got asked by this question a lot too, and I always thought about it because you know, as a writer or as a book, when you read a book, first of all you're gonna see the writer's voice, the author's voice, and then you're gonna have the narrator's voice, and those two voices sometimes can align. When they do, it's easy because you are in this culture, the author is in this culture, and you can channel your culture through this character in the novel. And this happens, and it's easier. But is it really necessary? Does that require author have to write within her culture? I don't think so. I don't think it's necessary. For instance, like in my novel, The Last Rose of Shanghai, the main character was Chinese, and she was that selfish, spoiled, wealthy Chinese. And you can see her voice, you can hear her voice through what he thought and how she reacted. And it was easy for me to imagine because I had a lot of friends just like that. So it was like, well, that's easy to do. But in my next novel, The Night Angels, the main character, she was from Boston, and she was half Chinese and half Irish. So her main thought, her worldview was completely different from a Chinese person. She actually was very confused when those Chinese would ask you, have you eaten your breakfast? And she's like, it's my business if I eat my breakfast or not. Why would you ask me? So it was confusing. This kind of nuance will show up in the novel, and as a careful reader, you would tell that. But the dangerous thing is to assume that you have to do this. As a writer, you have to stick to your culture. And especially when you have this contract, you have to negotiate with the publisher, and the publisher kindly remind you, hey Weina, it might not be a good idea for you to write a novel about Byron. Okay, so then in that way the writer feels restricted and you are being pigeonholed. You have to write in this culture. Another thing is, for the writers who are going to write something who's outside of the culture, it's easy to stereotype all those characters as well if you don't do any research. You just put some cap on this Asian person and you just assume everything she does is what you can imagine. And this is kind of dangerous as well.
Weina, you just raised such a great point because what's been happening in publishing and writing for the last decade has been that type of belief that people can only write exactly what they know. And it's so constricting on both sides. You know, it puts everybody in jail, and it has nothing to do with art. And you know, so this question is related to this larger one of who's going to do the creating and what do we actually think art is, and who can tell the truth about things. And it's actually the more important question that's embedded in the one that always gets asked, you know, about how to, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of, there's been several high-profile cases recently about authors getting into hot water because they wrote outside of their experience, and people had differing reactions to that, and some of those reactions were, you know, to try to put that person back in their place, and we don't have the time tonight to kind of expound on that, but you know, when we think about writing what our experience is, it is very constraining. That's not why we write fiction. We write fiction to explore, we write fiction to learn. But also, if you look back, I mean, how many women authors wrote male characters, right? Barbara Kingsolver was never a boy. she wrote Demon Copperhead, right? And got the Pulitzer. So where is that line? You know, where do you draw that line as to what constitutes an experience that you can write about that's not your own? And I think when it comes down to, you know, people's ethnicities and people's appearances and people's cultures, it becomes a much more heated and sort of tenuous topic than whether a woman can write a male character, for example.
Yeah, I think we always talk about, when we talk about this aspect, we also talk about the execution and the intention. I mean, most writers have the best intention, but the execution has a lot to do with diligence. And if you get lazy and that everything is easy, you just read the book and you just have assumptions. But execution is in a way to show the respect to the character as well as the culture.
That is a nice positive note to end this section on. But you've each sort of alluded a little bit to the process of your writing and your getting your work out there. Weina, you mentioned a publisher. We've all had experiences with having to maybe conform to something so that our book will get published, or have to really think about whether this is a change we were comfortable making and whether we're going to give up an opportunity or stick to our guns. That's a horrible expression. I don't like. Why stick to our guns? Sorry about that. So could you each tell us a little bit about sort of what's known as your writer's journey, and if anything stood out to you in particular during the process, either positively or in a challenging fashion? And I think we started once with, have we started with you, Rishi? Okay, so we're starting with Weina.
With me, okay.
Yes, with you.
So, all right, so my writer's journey.
I got it.
So, I'm the kind of boring person who wanted to be a writer since I was in 3rd grade. And I started to write and publish my first short story when I was in 5th grade. And I made 7 RMB, which was like $1. But I felt like a millionaire. I published my first novel in 2016, and I think around yours, Rishi, was it 2016? Okay, never mind. So it took me 10 years to write my first novel, The Moon in the Palace. It was a biographical fiction about the first and only Chinese female ruler in ancient China, 7th century. Like I said, it took me 10 years to write in English because you can tell I was born in China and my native language is Chinese. And it took me 4 years to query agents, and I received 82 rejection letters from agents. And most of the feedback was saying the story I wrote does not resonate with American readers. And also, my books are not gonna sell. They told me repeatedly, it's not gonna sell, it's not gonna sell, it's not gonna sell. So it was kind of, more than disheartening to hear this kind of feedback for a period of 4 years. But I was very stubborn. I couldn't do anything else. I was only able to write, so I just kept on it. I stick to my gun. So I finally got published, and I got the offer to publish 2 novels, which is a duology about this empress. And the reason it was a duology, it's 2 books, and not trilogy, was because the publisher's words, it's not gonna sell if there are 3 books. So it became 2 books, and now I have published 4 books, and I have more coming up, and can't tell you more the details, but this is it.
It's very exciting. Weina's most recent book just was on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. Yeah, that's excellent. And actually, that's kind of a big deal also. It's a big deal, but it's especially a big deal because the publishing industry usually sort of looks at the first 3 months after a book comes out, and you've either made it or you haven't, which is just terrible. But this was what, 18 months after your book came out? So Weina's stubborn perseverance definitely has been paying off.
Thank you.
Rishi.
I had a similar story as Weina's. I wanted to be a writer from a very, very young age, and was always writing when I was, doing other things, like in school. And because my parents were very similar to yours, Grace, where, really practical. My father came over as a physician. He did not have all of his teeth pulled out before he came. He came over with a full set of teeth. And he didn't have a he still doesn't have a cavity. But anyway, I was encouraged to follow in his footsteps and not take up writing because it's not really any way that you can be, you can't really earn a living from writing. So I was pushed towards something professional, and I decided to go to law school. That was considered to be a rebellion against, going to medical school. So it was always a fight for me from the very beginning. But in the end, it was like just a way to survive. To write was just a way to survive, and sort of, I also, I think very similar to both of you, did a lot of growing up in a town where there was very, very few other South Asians. So in my town, there were 26 South Asians, only one of whom spoke the language that we spoke when I went to high school. So the writing was and the reading was a way to sort of process what was happening until I could get to a place where there were more people like me, and I had a bigger community. So that was sort of what started my love of literature, and as I said, this was the story.
Were you reading? Did you have access to, or were you reading books by others, Asian or South Asian writers at the time?
They were around. I mean, Salman Rushdie was huge.
Right. Yeah.
Bharati Mukherjee was sort of, a big person on the American stage. And I was impressed that they existed, but I almost didn't find them interesting. And I was writing about non-Indian characters when I started to write. I think it was weird that was a split in my head, that there were Indian authors there, but they weren't really interesting. And then when I started to write, I was writing, about non-Indian authors. That changed when I went to a writing program, and I was able to arrange an independent study with author Anita Desai, who had so many of those, I mean, it was life-changing for me to go and sit in her office, and she was an Indian woman right here in Cambridge, and how she encouraged just another voice. It was, I don't think I could have done anything, without her encouragement, and sort of seeing that she had already done this, and it was a possible path.
It's interesting what you say about reading those authors and not finding them interesting. I remember being in a minority with my mother in not really getting the whole big deal about Jhumpa Lahiri's early book, the short stories, the one that sort of put her on the map. I forget the name.
Interpreter Mallory.
Interpreter, yes. And everybody was raving about it. Obviously, she's a brilliant writer, but my mom and I kind of looked at each other and were like, this is about Bengalis in Cambridge. We know about Bengalis in Cambridge. It's not interesting to us. I think when I read fiction, I want something different. I want to experience a different world. And so while I could appreciate the quality of the writing, it was just not one of my favorite books. So in terms of dealing with publishers, did you have any particularly sort of salient experiences with, the editing process, or any? It's fine if you didn't. It's great if you didn't. But I'm just curious. Like, for example, I was told at some point that I should put a Western character in my book, which takes place in the 1500s in northwestern India, in the desert of Rajasthan. There was no white people there, like even coming through, really, as far as I know. So, that was one where I put my foot down. that's not happening. So I don't know if you had any of those experiences, or hopefully the world has evolved.
Are you asking me, Anjali?
Any of you. I'm looking at you because like here, but I look at all of you.
I had a great first-time editor named Lee Boudreau. Just loved her, was so respectful, and I didn't have that experience with her when she purchased these two books. Later on, it became really difficult, I think, in weird ways. My agent told me once that she was in the room where two editors at one of these big publishing houses were talking about what the season's books were that were going to come out on a particular season. And one editor said, you know, this is a great book by so-and-so, we should really buy this one too. And that person's boss said something like, we already have a Chinese author on our list for this year, you know, for this season. And this is not like, I mean, you guys are all nodding because
we already have an India book.
We have all heard that same story. So I don't know. Grace didn't get to answer that last question though, so.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
I'm sorry.
no, that's okay.
Got caught up in the conversation.
I grew up, as I said, like I grew up in this small town, New England town, but my parents were friends with other Filipino immigrants who were doctors, and so that's what I thought you could be when you grew up. Like I only thought you could be a doctor. And so I did pre-med studies all the way through college, and it took me a while to realize like, oh, I'm not really good at this. I study a lot, I'm not doing that well. I faint when I go do my internships at the hospital, like maybe I should find something else. But writing was always there, and reading was always there. I just never imagined that I would ever make a living doing it or continue it through my life professionally in any way. You know, this is where you can have a conversation with somebody and they can change things for you. And for me, it was different professors would say to me, encourage me in various ways. And maybe it was just offhand, but they would say things like, have you thought about going to graduate school for writing? And I said like, no, I don't even know what that is. And I don't have enough money. I don't want to like go into debt and all that stuff. And they said like, well, no, like, if you're one of the top students, it'll be paid for. And so I didn't know that. I didn't know that that was possible, and that opened up an opportunity. And I thought, well, let me just see what happens. Like I'll try and see if I can be one of those people that gets a fellowship or something. And so once I did get into grad school and went and got an MFA, that is when things really shifted and changed. And even if I didn't think that I would make my living from my books, which very few people do. I don't remember the percentage of people in the Authors Guild who make their living just on their books, but it's pretty small. And so once I knew that there is a life in books, even if it's not just from my publishing, then I found a pathway and something that was possible.
That's great. And I'm gonna stick with you. This is no longer. I don't think this is.
Here's this one.
Okay, thank you. Troubleshooting. Much better. I'm going to stick with you to start off the next question because I think there's a segue there. I was going to ask you originally, since you have nonfiction, if you've received any feedback or reactions or communication from readers who were particularly, affected by your story. And I'm going to wrap that into the general question, which is, what do each of you, starting with Grace, what do each of you want the readers, what would you like your readers to get out of your book or books? 1 book, 2 books, 4 books, not 8 books.
I've been lucky enough to meet readers throughout the country, and it's been some incredible interactions. Like I'm thinking about this one Filipino-American young woman in high school. I think she's a sophomore, and she walked up to me and then just burst into tears. And I kind of got it. I understood, without her even saying anything, I kind of understood what that was about. It was to see yourself reflected in some way. I know my particular life is different from someone else's life, but what draws me to books is that I don't feel so alone. There's some way that I feel connected or entertained or lose myself a little bit in someone else's story, and yet I find myself in their story. So there's all these ways that you can find yourself in a book, and I've always thought my dream for when I was editing my book and making decisions about what to keep out and what to keep in was I wanted to make the kind of book that people would feel like read in one sitting, feel excited about, and want to give to somebody else. Like that was the dream. Like you would say, you need to read this, and want to give it to someone that they cared about. That's what my ambitions were with it.
And are you working on another book?
I am. I'm working on fiction next. The thing that I'm revising now is a novel based on my father and his friends, so it's outside of my experience, and it's based all in one day on Cape Cod when the men decide that they're going to recreate a Filipino fiesta and try to slaughter a goat.
On the Cape.
On the Cape.
Excellent. Which, in Chatham?
Falmouth. And the goat arrives in the back of my uncle's red Porsche convertible. So that's what
I would like to read that book. Rishi, what would you like readers to get out of this book, your other book, any future books?
Yeah, this book especially,
I think it is working.
It's working.
this book especially, it was all based on factual events. Like every major thing that happens in this book was something that I read about in a newspaper, or that some folks that were in their 60s or 70s told me had happened with their parents when they first settled in this region. So in writing this book, and specifically, I wanted folks to learn about this little-known part of American history, and then feel like they could include these people's stories in the story of America. That was quite clear. And also that it would start some conversations about why don't we know this? What is the reason that we didn't learn about this in school, or why don't we think about the contributions of these populations in the building of this country from World War I to even before World War I. One thing that has often happened when people have written about this book, like on Goodreads or on Amazon, or people talk about World War II, and they're just writing their review and they think it's, and I'm like, you read that whole 400-page book and you still think it's World War II? Whatever. But that is important to me. How it is.
Yeah, for sure. And if you could, since we have a couple of minutes, if you can just tell people a little bit about your first book.
It's a collection of short stories that are based mostly in Boston, on a pretend Indian American population around here. Because when I first moved here, I really loved it, and I felt like, wow, I really wish that this is where my parents had settled and I had been able to be part of the Indian community here. So I just made up the whole thing in a childhood that I never had. That was my exercise in learning how to write, and each one of the stories is from a different, I was experimenting. Could I write an older woman's character? Could I write a 14-year-old boy's character? Could I write, a 21-year-old young woman's character? It was just like a way to teach myself how to do it.
And maybe it's because you were sort of doing it in a more kind of playful or exploratory manner for yourself, but I actually did enjoy your short stories more than I enjoyed Balahiri's. Weina.
So I'm a professional escape artist because I write fiction, so I don't have to talk about reality. I write historical fiction, so you guys can look into the past and forget about the present. So what I do with my book, I wanted people to discover present by reading historical novels, because we have a lot of we have a lot of hurt now, we have a lot of ignorance, we have a lot of tensions going on in this world, but many of this do not occur in vacuum. It had happened before and happened again again. So by looking into the past, all the incidents that happened in the past, I built a wall of insulation. So when you read the historical novel, you will feel safe, but you can still see what the problem was. And maybe you can still see things have not changed. We have not changed at all. And maybe my biggest ambition is, with my books, when you read them, it will be able to build a bridge of understanding between Asians and between Americans and between Asian Americans as a community as well. That's it.
And I'm just going to add one question, which we didn't put on the list, but it's not a trick question. But we've talked about what you'd like readers to get out of your books, and we've talked a bit about your motivation to write them. Did you find that you learned something about yourselves, or that you were surprised by something in the process of writing your books, either in maybe some of the themes you didn't realize you were going to be exploring, or a character who sort of grew up bigger than you thought, or just some insight into your own? You don't all have to answer if you don't have an answer.
Okay, so I do learn a lot about myself. I realize my heroes, they are a lot more stronger than me. And I wanted to be them, but it doesn't work at home.
That's what draws me to writing, is discovery. That's what I get out of it. So even if I'm writing about events in my own life that have happened, I'm still discovering something about it.
Great. Well, I think we have some time for questions. So are you all ready for questions? Okay. I don't know, should we pass the mic around, or if you just enunciate it, I can repeat the question? We're down to 2 mics, I think. I think Rishi's works.
Okay. Is it on?
I think so.
Hello. Is it on? Okay. Rishi, this is a question for you.
You have to hold it pretty close.
Okay. This is a question to Rishi Reddi. When we were sort of trying to read and thinking about which page to read, or I'm sitting here and I was trying to prompt you, talk about the cattle of harvest, or talk about, read from the army experience, or this and that. To me, they were such well-researched scenes that even though I've read the book so many years back, they are still very alive, very vivid. And my question to you was, why did you choose 1930s, and why did you choose the Sikh people immigrating here? Did you have any other choice in mind?
Can you just repeat it?
Yeah, so I think the question is why did I choose 1913 and why did I choose the Sikh population? And thank you for those 2 suggestions to read, because I'll remember those for the next time. But it was all historically based. So when I first learned about this group of South Asians who had moved here, it was in law school when we were studying a case around citizenship, and a man who had applied, a Punjabi man who had applied for citizenship to the United States, had won the citizenship. That award was appealed by the United States, and it was later, the citizenship was rescinded. And I didn't know that there had been a South Asian population in the United States that early. So this is in law school, so I went in and I started to research that population. I realized, wow, there's this whole group of Punjabis who had come to the US after having served in the British Army and Cavalry, and they landed in Canada and then came south and just populated the western coast of the United States. Had no idea. My family had come here in 1971 when I was 4 or 5 years old, and we were really arrogant about being the first. We were the first people here, nobody, and here, 2.5 generations before, there have been so many people of Indian descent, South Asian descent, I should say. It was British India that were here. So once I decided I was going to write it as a historical novel that was really factually as accurate as it could be, it was a commitment that I made. I didn't want to just be freewheeling around. I thought I had to go to 1913 when there was a sizable population, when the first riots against the Japanese and the South Asians started, when the first Sikh temple was established in California. It was a big year for that population, so that's why I chose it. And then it aligned very nicely with some of the real factual events that had happened to particular people. Thank you.
Other questions? There's a question over here.
So this is a question just for anyone. Do you have any advice for people that want to be writers?
Is a question for who?
Just anyone.
Oh, anyone. Advice. Advice for people who want to be writers.
Don't show your work too early to anybody who you don't trust. Because half of my whole first book I wrote to my college roommate because we were really close. And I knew she would say she liked every single story, whether or not, whether or not she thought it was really good, because I knew she would like the story. I actually never showed it to her for a really long time, but that type of love, that type of generosity was really important in my mind to be able to get the words out on paper.
I'll add to that also to not be shy about taking classes, and it doesn't have to mean, a whole long program. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily go get an MFA, but finding ways to really hone your craft and read writing books, read extensively, and it takes time. It takes time, but it's worth it. Any other advice?
Read, like everyone is saying here, but also practice regularly. It's like doing anything that you want to get better at. You don't wait around for inspiration, like you practice regularly.
Every day.
Yeah, every day if possible, but regularly and you'll get better over time.
I mean, I want to put a little asterisk next to the practice every day because, I used to be really intimidated by that because I just didn't necessarily have the opportunity to do that every day, especially as I grew older and I had jobs and kids and I didn't want to feel like just because I wasn't writing every day, I wasn't still a writer. So, but there's other ways that the everyday part can be keeping a story in your mind, thinking about characters, reading a page or two of a book and taking a little time to think about how the author did a certain thing. I mean, writing is not always just the act of putting pen to paper or fingers to whatever your device is. A lot of, I would say at least 50%, if not 80% of writing, it takes place in those other times.
So, I think you got a great advice here. Now what you need to do is just go home and sit down and write. But seriously, believe in yourself. Don't believe in anyone else, just believe in yourself. This is all you need because sometimes you will hear rejection. Sometimes you will hear disappointing words. But don't let them stop you. Believe in yourself and be single-minded.
First of all, I wanted to thank all of you. I came here because I read your bios and you were so impressive, but I didn't expect to like all of you, each one of you, so much. being a member of the community, we feel some of the same needs as you, like express yourself and share the stories as Asian Americans. And then if you look around at the banners, this is also part of the same effort. One of the banners said, "Our stories are still being told." So, so I really thank all of you for telling that story. And thinking about, now we have your generation and the generation that's coming up. And do you see maybe, in the in-between generation, people in their 30s or maybe in their 20s, do you see there are more and more Asian American writers telling our stories?
Everybody's nodding, for sure.
Yeah, I do. Like I said earlier, I used to write listicles every year for publication and recommending them the novels written by Asian Americans. And I do notice a lot of writers are young and they are in their 20s and they are professionals, but they work during the day and at night they would just write. And they have contracts under the belts and they write beautiful stories, and the stories are very relevant today to many immigrants, especially about identity and other cultural clash. So it's very encouraging to hear that.
It's also, I just want to add one thing to that, in terms of the formation of a literary culture in a nation, like when you have to have a certain number of folks within the conversation for books to be in conversation with each other, to be able to be in a place where you could have people of similar cultures or backgrounds be in conversation through their books to present, a whole array of perspectives. That's a wonderful moment in the formation of a literary culture. It doesn't happen when there's just 2 or 3 or 4 writers speaking into the white dominant culture of literature. And I kind of feel like we've gotten to some of that recently, in the past 5 or 10 years. There's more of that where, I don't know if folks on the panel agree, but I certainly feel like that's what's happening.
Go ahead.
So when I started grad school and being a writer more seriously, I would always buy a book by whoever Asian American author had come out with a new book, because I knew how important it is to support them in the first 3 months. So I would do that with my grad school money. And it'd be maybe once a month, once every few months, once a year. And then now, I cannot keep up. I try to keep up with okay, what's new, even just with Filipino Americans. And I think there should still be more, but I'm just saying that I do know in my lifetime things have shifted.
And I think also not just for Asian writers, but for anybody whose writing has historically here in the U.S. had a harder time getting out there. There are so many more avenues now. The traditional publishing industry is complex and often hard to break into. But there are so many other ways now to reach readers. You can have a Substack newsletter, you can write on Medium, you can write on social media, you can, I think for a while, is Wattpad still a thing? Because I know, I have one kid who's 18, but some of her friends were writing on Wattpad, sharing their writing. My other child writes on Google Docs and shares. They're co-writing a book with 3 friends. There's just so many more ways and to think of what publication means, and to think about how connecting readers can look like. It's not just a one size kind of publishing experience. Other questions? Yes.
This is hold it up. Okay. This is a question to Anjali Duva. So the last time when you were reading Faint Promise of Rain, you had said that 3 more books are going to come, and it's going to be about kathak, and it's going to be coming soon. Where are you at that process?
I'm impressed that you remember that, thank you. And now I'm on the spot. The process has been a long one, and to cut to the chase, I broke up with my agent. That was like a big thing. And it set me back a few years because that was also right before the pandemic and everything kind of slowed down. And so I had to kind of pause for 3 years to find a new agent. So back to what Weina was talking about, sending out queries, getting all those rejections, and persevering and revising. And so I signed with a new fabulous agent in the fall, and she is in the process. She's sending out my manuscript now to editors, and that is for my second book. And I have already started my third one, and I've also started a third one, which it actually takes place on Cape Cod, and is contemporary because I needed a little break from all the heavy-duty research. But yeah, my second one takes place in the 1850s in the city of Lucknow, and it actually, harking back to one of my questions that I asked all of you, I had a character in it who's a young boy, and he's mixed race, or whatever we want to call it. He's half French, half Catholic white French, and half Indian Muslim. And he was going to be just sort of a side character, and he ended up growing to be one of the two main protagonists of the story. And I realized that in everything I do, I'm really drawn to the in-betweens and the overlaps and the things and people that are both this and that. And that has actually characterized my whole career and how my first book was published. And now I've learned to just embrace that and really kind of inhabit that space of looking for the exciting things that can happen in the overlaps and in-betweens. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, yes.
I wanted to ask Grace how was Imelda Marcos taken by the people of Philippines.
So you want me to comment on Imelda Marcos?
Yeah.
I mean, her son won the recent election, so the family's back in power. That wasn't my choice. I mean, that's not what I would recommend, but there's a lot of reasons why that happened in terms of narrative and how someone can control a narrative and get people to erase a history. So that's not I did not support that particular candidate. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, well, this has been wonderful. I just want to thank our authors, Grace, Rishi, Weina, and Anjali tonight for joining us and sharing their stories. I think it's so important to share all the stories that you have, whether it's like nonfiction or if it's fiction. It just tells, it helps to share our culture to the world. And I want to thank you for that.
Helen, thank you so much for having this panel.